We welcome you once again to the ancient paths.
Yes.
Now today we want to continue with our discourse, and this episode we'll be asking ourselves very difficult questions. When God calls you, let's say from point A to point B becomes your destination. Should be expected, if it is God calling you, then point B should be better than point A. Better in the sense of safety. It should be more secure. It should be more promising than your previous encounter in point A. But is that always the case? Because we mentioned the people who've been called. We mentioned Moses, we mentioned Abraham, we mentioned Noah. And all these people, even you today, if God has called you, it would be your experience that it is not an assurance that because God called you, it becomes more safe, it becomes more reliable, it becomes more certain. And there are challenges that people encounter, those who have been called. Now, these challenges, these difficulties are to shape, refine, and bring out a character that is to fit the call to the calling that has been presented to them.
Yes.
And that brings us to today's episode.
The valley of decision.
Yes, the valley of decision. Look, here is Abraham, or then called Abram. He settled in Canaan. The journey has been long from the Ur of Chaldean, as we looked at that story in our last episode. Now, in Canaan, that is the destination where God had called him to go. Now, that is his point B. There are strange things that happen. As he settles there, famine strikes. That is one point. The second point, God does not communicate the way forward, leave alone the information about the famine. So somehow we can say God is silent. So what do you do when God is silent? Let us learn a few things that Abraham did. He listened to what God told him the last time God spoke.
Yes.
God called him out of Ur to a land that he was to show him. Now he is at that land. The thing that he didn't do, he didn't go back to Ur. That would be against the call. But Abram decides to go to Egypt because he weighs the situation, and then he makes a move to a place that could offer him security. But before making that journey, he designs, I don't know if we can call it an exit or an entry strategy into Egypt.
Yes. So when you read Genesis chapter 12, verse 13, Abraham is saying to Sarah that, "Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee."
Wow. So Abraham is scared, and out of this fear, I think the hope and trust he had in God is diminishing, as our experience all the time. So in this time, Abraham designs a lie in that it was true that Sarah was a distant sister, but it was not true. They avoided the aspect of Sarah being the wife.
Yeah.
Now this reflects Abraham's character, that of fear, and designing this lie to save himself. The second aspect that it gives is the character of the people of his time. The things that Abraham was fearing, they actually happened the way he predicted them.
Yeah.
When he goes to Egypt, there is trouble, and out of this lie he coined, he is saved. Now, let us see how he was treated based on the script of a lie that he designed.
Okay, so Genesis chapter 12, verse 16, it says, "And he entreated Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen, and he asses, and men servants, and maid servants, and she asses, and camels." Verse 17, "And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife."
Now look, because of this lie, it was convenient enough, and Abram is now granted a lot of things, wealth. He's given sheep, servants, gold, silver, and all these things. Now, had he said that Sarai was the wife, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know if he would have gotten these things, but that one we leave at that point. Now, the lie was bought by those people, and it survived. But there is a convenience that a lie can bring for a time. But in the long run, we find the truth is coming out, and it can be very detrimental. The very death Abraham is trying to escape could have been his fate had this turned out the way it was to turn out without God's intervention. But we find God coming in mightily. In spite of Abram's mistakes and failures and shortcomings, God looks beyond that into a future that he had promised him when he was making a covenant with him. Now, what does that tell us about God? That he sticks with this covenant and he comes to fulfill them regardless of our mistakes and our faults. Our reaction to him should not be based out of fears in the extent that if I don't do this, God is now waiting to punish me. But it should be focused on the sense that God is waiting to have a relationship with us, so that whatever we do, we are actuated by love based on what God has done to us in the past and what he can do to us in the future.
Amen.
This comes through. And Abram is ejected out of Egypt.
Yes.
Because God came in to salvage his covenant. Had Sarai gone just like that, it would have been difficult for God to fulfill that promise that he had made in the future. So God stands in with the promise. Now, Abram is ejected out. Now, what happens?
Okay, so as Abraham and chapter 13 it says, and Abraham went out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south.
Yes.
So you find that Abraham lives rich, very rich in cattle, as you mentioned, silver and gold. And then the interesting part of verse 4, it says, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at first, and there Abraham called on the name of the Lord.
Wow. Oh, that's interesting. You see, when Abram settled in Canaan, there's that place, it's called Bethel, house of God. That's where he made an altar. Then when famine came, he went to Egypt. He remembers, after God delivering him out of Egypt, to come back and call on the name of the Lord. Amen. Remember, in Egypt, there's no mention of Abraham calling on the name of the Lord. But God still saved him. Now, based on that salvation, Abraham comes to worship, not because he fears punishment, but because he appreciates that which God has done to him.
Yes.
And that is even our calling today. God is not calling you just to worship out of fear, but based on the things that he has done and his ability to fulfill the promises that he has made unto you.
Amen.
Then that opens, Abraham has a habit of collecting the people, his people, and working with them. Now he makes it with Lot, and there's trouble. They're now wealthy,
Yeah.
Too much cattle, and now they start arguing on whose water point and whose grazing site is this. And that argument reaches Abram, and Abram, as a senior and a man who's seen God's, a senior person and a man who's seen God's hand, brings a ceasefire and says, okay guys, it must not continue like this. Lord, take this direction. If you take the opposite, the one direction, I'll take the opposite. I don't know how it goes. What happens?
Yes. So chapter 13, verse 8, it says, and Abraham said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren.
Yes.
Then verse 10 says, and Lot lifted up his eyes, and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Verse 11, then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east.
Wow. So Lot is journeying east, and he settles in the cities of in the cities of the plain.
Yes.
And he looks at Jordan. So what makes Lot to choose has nothing to do with God's calling. It has nothing to do with principle, but it is everything to do with convenience and comfort. And the city, it was not just the green pastures and the watering points, but as a city, it was a commercial hub. So there was business interest. So of all the things that Lot considered, God must have not really been at the center. But if you look at what Abram does, Abram remains in Canaan. Why? Because God had called him to that place called Canaan. You'll tell us, I think as we close, what it means to move by sight and by faith. Because from here, Lot is moving by sight, Abram is moving by faith. But before that, God comes to reaffirm his covenant to Abram.
Yes.
What does he say?
So Genesis still chapter 13, verse 15, it says, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. Verse 17 says, arise, walk through the land in the length of it, and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee.
Wow. Now God comes to affirm his promise that don't worry, Abram, I'm with you. Now walk. take a stretch, go around, whatever you see, this land I'm going to give to you with, you see, now that is the problem. Here comes the conundrum. God has a promise, but the promise does not marry with reality. Why? Because reality is Abram, above 75 years old, has no child.
Yeah.
Sarah is coming of age, no child. They are childless. What do you do when God's promise contradicts the reality? How does it happen when in your career or in your job, the things that God promised you seems to diminish in the wake of the reality you are in? It could be your family. It could be your life. It could be every aspect of your existence. There are instances we find reality contradicting the promises of God. Yes, we know the promises, but when we look at reality, they don't match.
Yeah.
Does it call a walk by sight, like Lot did, or does it need a walk by faith, as Abram did? Yes.
Dear viewer, as we have read the story, the two cultures are still at play. Just like Lot, he made a decision. And as we go through our episode, we'll see what costed that decision. But Abraham, though walking by faith, took God at his word. Dear viewer, Jesus desires a personal relationship with you. As you walk with him daily, say the promises of God, and for sure they shall be fulfilled in your life. Thank you.
Amen.